I think it's important to remember that the Bible gives us a view behind the veil into an unseen spiritual realm. Get your coffee. In Daniel chapter 10, the prophet Daniel has an encounter with what appears to have been a mighty angelic being. There are different ideas among commentators as to who exactly this being is. But during the interaction with the angelic being, Daniel is told that this being was sent to him because of his prayers. But after this angelic messenger was dispatched, he was withstood for 21 days by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. During that period, another angelic being, one that is actually given a name, Michael, came to help this messenger that was speaking to Daniel in Daniel chapter 10. The whole passage is a fascinating look behind the veil into, I believe, another realm, the unseen spiritual realm. And behind the veil, in this unseen realm, it seems, as many Bible teachers believe, there are principalities and powers that are positioned over earthly powers. In other words, there are spiritual forces that stand or govern over earthly forces and entities. The prince of the kingdom of Persia, spoken of in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13, seems to be a spiritual being, an angelic being that was connected to Persia. And this angelic being stands in opposition to God. So it is an evil angelic being that the two angels, one unnamed and the other called Michael, withstood as they sought to make their way to Daniel, who had been praying and fasting for 21 days. These are the kinds of things in the Bible that weird people out who live in the 21st century. The Bible indicates that there are spiritual forces involved in an unseen realm, and those unseen spiritual conflicts have an impact on things happening here in the earthly realm. Yes, it sounds like something from Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, but it isn't fiction. All that is kind of an intro into where we're at in Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapters 13 through 23 are a series of judgments spoken by God through the prophet Isaiah upon the nations of Isaiah's day. 28 centuries ago, nations like Moab, which was a nation in what is today modern-day Jordan, or Syria, or Assyria, or Ethiopia, which was much bigger than the nation of Ethiopia that we think of today, or Egypt. All these different nations, they are spoken of in these chapters, and they're seen as being judged by God in these chapters. In chapters 13 and 14 of Isaiah, the vision of the prophet Isaiah is against the nation of Babylon. And in chapter 14, we read in the midst of this burden against Babylon about the fall of an angelic being that was connected to the nation of Babylon. So in the same way that there was an angelic being that was connected to Persia in Daniel chapter 10, there is an angelic being that we read of in Isaiah chapter 14 that seems to be connected to the nation of Babylon 2,800 years ago. But this angelic being is not called the prince of the kingdom of Persia. He's given a name, and what is said about this angelic being gives us another look into the unseen realm. The angelic being in Isaiah chapter 14, his name is Lucifer. You've probably heard that name before. Lucifer, the son of the morning, the one who weakened the nations, the one who you might know of as Satan, the one who we think of as the adversary, the one who opposes God and everything that is of God. People connect Lucifer with the devil. And Lucifer, before he was an adversary opposing God, he was apparently an angelic being with access to the heavenly realm until he fell. And his fall is pictured for us in the vision of Isaiah and Isaiah chapter 14. There, Isaiah, he says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations." In Ezekiel 28, this same being seems to be connected with the ancient city-state of Tyre, another wicked city-state like Babylon. In Ezekiel 28, we are given a description of this once glorious angelic being. But then in Isaiah 14 and in Revelation chapter 12, we read about the fall of this being. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. And why is this being, now connected with nations in history that oppose God, why did this being fall? He tells us in Isaiah 14, for you, Lucifer, have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation, on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. 5 I wills that Lucifer says there in Isaiah chapter 14. I will be in heaven over the angels, over man, over the earth. I will be like God. And that 5th I will be like God. It's kind of interesting because what did the serpent, the personification of this being, Lucifer, say to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3? He said, in the day that you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, you will be like God. So we see these I wills of Lucifer in Isaiah 14. We see his arrogance and his haughtiness, that he wants to be above all that God had made and be like God. But God in Isaiah 14, he responds with 5 I wills of his own against all those that oppose him. You can go and read those 5 I wills from God in Isaiah 14, verses 22 and 23, 25, and 30. The spiritual powers that oppose God, like Lucifer, are still at work in the world today. Babylon, Tyre, Assyria, Philistia, these nations that Lucifer and other principalities and powers that they were moving behind in ancient times, those nation states are no more. But the spirits, or the spirit like Lucifer, that was at work behind the scenes, warring against all that is of God, that spirit is still at work in the world, opposing all that is good. And the manifestations of that spirit are clearly evident in everything that wars against truth, goodness, and beauty. And you don't have to look very far, even at this moment in world history, to see that this spirit is still at work in the world today. There is still much that is opposing all that is true and good and beautiful. And you have to recognize that those manifestations in the earthly realm are merely manifestations of what is happening in the unseen realm. Something to think about. We'll see you next time.